On the morning of March 14, 2019, a silver Honda Accord was captured on a traffic camera heading southbound on Interstate 75, just outside of Findlay, Ohio. The timestamp read 9:47 a.m. The driver wore sunglasses and a dark jacket. Nothing about the vehicle or the person behind the wheel appeared unusual, except for one impossible detail. The registered owner of that Honda, 32-year-old Rachel Hartley, had been officially reported missing 4 days earlier. Rachel Hartley was a high school art teacher in the small town of Bowling Green, Ohio. She lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom rental on the east side of town. A quiet street lined with older homes and tall oak trees that had stood there for decades, their branches forming a canopy over the cracked sidewalks below. Her neighbors described her as private but friendly, the kind of person who waved when you passed by but rarely stopped to chat. She had moved to Bowling Green 3 years prior after accepting the teaching position at the local high school, the school that had been struggling with budget cuts and teacher retention but had seen a small renaissance in its arts program since Rachel arrived. Before Bowling Green, she'd lived in Columbus, working at a nonprofit arts organization called Creative Foundations, a place dedicated to bringing art education to underserved communities. She had spent 5 years there, coordinating programs, writing grants, organizing exhibitions. Friends from that period of her life said she'd been good at her job, deeply committed to the mission, but that the work had worn her down, the constant fundraising, the administrative burden, the emotional weight of seeing so many talented young people without resources. She'd been looking for a change, something quieter, something that felt less overwhelming, something where she could focus on teaching rather than fighting for survival. Her routine in Bowling Green was consistent, almost rhythmic in its predictability. She woke early, usually around 6, made coffee in a French press she'd bought at a thrift store, and spent the first hour of her morning preparing lesson plans or grading student work at her small kitchen table. She arrived at school by 7:30. Often one of the first teachers in the building, and taught for classes throughout the day, primarily painting and drawing, with one section of advanced portfolio development for seniors. She stayed late most afternoons to help students with projects or attend faculty meetings, and she rarely left before 5. On weeknights, she went to the gym 3 times a week, a Planet Fitness on the north side of town, where she mostly used the treadmill and occasionally attended a yoga class. On Fridays, she stopped at the same grocery store on her way home, a Kroger where the cashiers had started to recognize her. Saturdays were for errands and laundry, and sometimes she'd treat herself to lunch at a small cafe downtown that served sandwiches and locally roasted coffee. Sundays, she often drove to a state park about 40 minutes away, a place called Maumee Bay, to hike the trails or sit by the water and sketch. It was a life built on predictability, on small comforts and familiar patterns, and that predictability is exactly why her sudden absence was noticed so quickly. On the morning of March 10th, a Sunday, Rachel did not show up to school. This wasn't entirely unusual. Teachers call in sick, emergencies happen. But when the school's front office tried calling her cell phone, there was no answer. They left a voicemail, then another. By noon, the vice principal, a man named Dennis Kowalski who had worked at the school for nearly 20 years, tried her emergency contact, a woman named Laura Pemberton, who had been listed on Rachel's employment paperwork. Laura was a friend from Columbus, someone Rachel had known for nearly a decade, someone she'd worked with at Creative Foundations. Laura told the school she hadn't heard from Rachel in over a week, but that wasn't strange either. They texted occasionally, spoke on the phone maybe once a month. Their friendship had survived the distance, but it had changed, become less immediate, less central to their daily lives. Still, Laura said she'd try calling Rachel herself, see if maybe there was something going on, something personal that Rachel hadn't wanted to share with the school. But Laura's calls went to voicemail too, and as the afternoon wore on, a quiet unease began to settle in. Dennis Kowalski decided to drive by Rachel's house after school let out that afternoon. It was a 15-minute drive from the school, through residential streets that grew progressively quieter as he moved away from the center of town. When he pulled up to her address, Her car wasn't in the driveway. The blinds were drawn. There was no sign of activity. He knocked. No response. He tried calling again. Nothing. By Monday morning, when Rachel still hadn't appeared and still wasn't answering her phone, Dennis contacted the Bowling Green Police Department. An officer was dispatched to her home around 10 a.m. He knocked, peered through the windows, walked the perimeter of the property. Everything looked undisturbed. The doors were locked. There was no indication of a break-in or struggle. The grass was neatly mowed. The mailbox had a few pieces of mail inside, nothing excessive, maybe 2 or 3 days' worth. But her car, that silver Honda Accord, was still missing. Laura Pemberton drove up from Columbus that evening. She had a spare key to Rachel's apartment, something Rachel had given her years ago, back when they saw each other more often, back when Laura would sometimes drive up for the weekend, and they'd spend Saturday exploring small towns or visiting antique shops. Laura let herself inside, and what she found was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The apartment was clean. Dishes had been washed and put away. The bed was made, the comforter smoothed out, the pillows arranged neatly. Rachel's work bag sat on the kitchen table, her laptop inside it closed. Her phone charger was plugged into the wall beside her bed. A half-empty bottle of water sat on the nightstand. The trash had been taken out. The kitchen counter was clear except for a small ceramic bowl that held her keys. Except the keys weren't there. Laura walked through the room slowly, trying to piece together some kind of narrative, some explanation that would make sense. In the bathroom, Rachel's toothbrush was still in the holder. Her makeup bag sat on the counter, partially unzipped, a few items visible inside. In the closet, her clothes hung neatly on hangers, organized by type and color in the precise way Rachel had always kept things. Her winter coat was missing, but it was early March, still cold, the kind of cold that lingered in Ohio well into spring. That made sense. What didn't make sense was the complete absence of any note, any message, any indication of where she might have gone or why. Laura stood in the middle of the living room for a long time, just looking around, trying to see something she might have missed. The apartment felt frozen, like a photograph of a life that had suddenly stopped mid-frame. She called the police again. This time, they opened a missing person case. The initial investigation moved quickly. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Rachel in the past few days. Most neighbors said they'd barely noticed her absence. One elderly woman who lived 3 houses down said she thought she'd seen Rachel's car leave on Saturday morning, maybe around 11, but she couldn't be sure. She hadn't paid much attention. Detectives spoke to Rachel's co-workers, pulling each one aside for interviews. They all described her the same way. Dedicated, quiet, professional. She didn't socialize much outside of school events, didn't join the other teachers for happy hour on Fridays, but she was well-liked, respected. Her students adored her. She had a way of making them feel seen, of treating their work seriously, of pushing them to improve without making them feel inadequate. One coworker, an English teacher named Marissa Lindholm, mentioned that Rachel had seemed a little off in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Not dramatically different, but just slightly withdrawn. She'd been quieter during lunch breaks, less engaged in conversations. Marissa had asked her once if everything was okay, and Rachel had smiled and said yes, everything was fine, just tired. Detectives reviewed Rachel's recent credit card transactions. There were no purchases after March 9th, the Saturday before she disappeared. Her last known activity was a withdrawal of $60 from an ATM near her apartment at 11:13 a.m. that morning. Surveillance footage from the ATM showed Rachel alone, wearing jeans and a navy blue jacket, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her expression neutral and remarkable. She completed the transaction, got back in her car, and drove away. The footage showed her turning right out of the parking lot, heading west. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. Her phone, when investigators finally obtained records from her carrier, had last pinged off a cell tower near Maumee Bay State Park, the place she often visited on Sundays. around 1:30 p.m. on that same Saturday. After that, it went dark. Either the phone had been turned off, the battery had died, or it had been destroyed. Detectives reached out to her family. Rachel's parents, Robert and Susan Hartley, lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a 4-hour drive north. They were retired, Robert a former accountant, Susan a former nurse. They said they'd last spoken to Rachel 2 weeks prior, a brief conversation about an upcoming visit they'd planned for Easter. Rachel had sounded fine, maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual. She'd mentioned a student art show she was organizing, said she was looking forward to the break. Her younger brother, Daniel, who lived in Denver and worked as a freelance graphic designer, hadn't talked to her in over a month. They texted occasionally, mostly memes and articles they thought the other would find interesting, but they weren't particularly close. None of them had any reason to believe she was in danger or planning to leave. Rachel didn't have a history of mental health crises. She'd never threatened to harm herself. She wasn't involved in any known conflicts. She didn't owe money. She wasn't seeing anyone romantically, at least not that anyone knew of. For the first few days, the case followed a familiar pattern. Searches were conducted in the areas she was known to visit. Volunteers walked through the trails at Maumee Bay State Park, calling her name, checking the wooded areas along the shoreline. Divers checked nearby bodies of water, the Maumee River, smaller ponds and retention basins. Her photograph was distributed to local news outlets, shared on social media, posted on community bulletin boards. Tips came in, but none of them led anywhere concrete. Someone thought they'd seen her at a gas station in Toledo. Someone else thought they'd seen her car parked outside a restaurant in Pearisburg. Both leads were investigated and ruled out. And then, on March 14th, 4 days after Rachel was last seen, something happened that changed everything. A traffic camera on Interstate 75, about 30 miles south of Bowling Green, near the town of Findlay, captured an image of a silver Honda Accord matching Rachel's license plate. The timestamp was 9:47 a.m. The vehicle was traveling southbound, moving at normal highway speed, keeping pace with the flow of traffic. When detectives reviewed the footage, they could see a figure in the driver's seat. The person wore sunglasses and a dark jacket. The image quality wasn't sharp enough to make a positive identification of the face, but the car was unmistakable. It was Rachel's. The discovery sent a jolt through the investigation. If Rachel's car was on the highway for days after she disappeared, then where had it been in the meantime? And more importantly, who was driving it? Detectives immediately began working with the Ohio State Highway Patrol to trace the vehicle's route. Additional cameras were checked, dozens of them along Interstate 75 and connecting highways. Toll booth records were reviewed, though there were no tolls on this particular stretch of road. Gas station surveillance in towns along the route was pulled and examined. But the trail went cold quickly. The car appeared on that single camera and then seemed to vanish. No further sightings were reported. No additional footage surfaced. It was as if the vehicle had simply dissolved into the flow of traffic and never emerged. The focus shifted to the possibility that Rachel was still alive, that she was driving the car herself, that perhaps she had left voluntarily. But this theory raised more questions than it answered. Why would she leave without telling anyone? Why would her phone go dead and stay dead? Why would she stop using her credit cards? And if she wanted to disappear, why would she drive on a major interstate where cameras might capture her? If someone wanted to vanish, there were easier ways to do it, quieter roads, less populated areas. Some investigators believe the person in the footage wasn't Rachel at all. Perhaps someone had taken her car. Perhaps she had been harmed, and the vehicle was being moved to a secondary location, somewhere it could be hidden or destroyed. But if that were true, why hadn't the car been found? And why would someone risk driving it on a busy highway in broad daylight, where they could be seen, recorded, traced? If you're finding this case as unsettling as I am, I do really appreciate it if you take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Cases like Rachel's don't always get the attention they deserve, and the more people who see this, the better chance we have of keeping her story alive. The case began to fracture into competing theories, each one plausible in its own way, each one impossible to prove. Some detectives leaned toward foul play. They believed Rachel had encountered someone, either by chance or by design, someone who had harmed her and then taken her vehicle. The fact that her car had been seen days later suggested the perpetrator was either incredibly reckless or incredibly confident, someone who believed they could move the vehicle without being caught. Others believed Rachel had experienced some kind of psychological break, a sudden crisis that had caused her to flee her life without warning. They pointed to the small signs her coworkers had noticed, the distraction, the withdrawal. They suggested she might now be living off the grid, avoiding contact, trying to start over somewhere far from anyone who knew her. Her family rejected this idea entirely. Rachel wasn't impulsive. She wasn't reckless. She loved her job. She had plans, responsibilities, people who depended on her. She wouldn't just walk away. A third theory, quieter, less discussed but still present in the back of everyone's minds, was that Rachel had taken her own life. That she had driven to some remote location, somewhere she felt connected to or drawn to, and ended things on her own terms. This theory was harder to investigate because it required finding a body, finding evidence of intent, finding something concrete. And so far, there was nothing. Weeks passed. Then months. The silver Honda Accord never turned up. No body was found. No further sightings were reported. Rachel's bank account remained untouched. Her social media, which had never been particularly active, went silent. Her apartment, eventually cleared out by her parents in late April, yielded no new clues. Everything she owned, every piece of her carefully ordered life, was boxed up and taken away, stored in a storage unit in Ann Arbor where her parents couldn't bring themselves to go through it. Detectives retraced her final known movements obsessively. They spoke to everyone at the school, everyone at the gym, everyone who worked at the stores she visited regularly. They pulled surveillance footage from gas stations, parking lots, intersections. They found nothing that explained the gap between her last confirmed sighting on March 9th and the appearance of her car on March 14th. One detail, however, kept resurfacing in witness statements. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, a few people had noticed Rachel seemed distracted. The coworker who mentioned it during the initial interviews wasn't the only one. A student named Emily Cho, a senior in Rachel's advanced portfolio class, said Rachel had been staring out the window during class one afternoon in late February, just staring, not moving, not responding. When Emily asked her a question about a painting technique, Emily had to say her name twice before Rachel snapped back to attention. A neighbor, the elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, recalled seeing Rachel sitting in her car in the driveway one evening, maybe a week before she disappeared. Just sitting there in the driver's seat, not moving, the engine off, the lights off. For nearly 20 minutes. The neighbor had been taking out her trash and had noticed Rachel there when she walked back inside. When she looked again 10 minutes later, Rachel was still there. Eventually, she'd gotten out of the car and gone inside, but the neighbor remembered thinking it was odd. These observations, on their own, meant very little. Everyone has moments of distraction, moments of introspection, moments where they sit in their car and think about things they don't want to think about inside their own home. But taken together, they hinted at something beneath the surface, something Rachel hadn't shared with anyone, something that might have been building for weeks or months. Detectives began to dig deeper into her life in Columbus, the years before she moved to Bowling Green. They spoke to former coworkers at creative foundations, old roommates, acquaintances from the coffee shops and art galleries she used to frequent. Most of them described her the same way her current friends did. Thoughtful, reserved, artistic, reliable. Someone who kept to herself but was always willing to help if you needed it. But a few mentioned that Rachel had gone through a difficult period about 5 years earlier, around 2014. She'd ended a long-term relationship, something that had left her withdrawn for months. She'd stopped going out, stopped responding to invitations, stopped attending the monthly gallery openings she used to love. Eventually, she'd seemed to recover, started engaging with people again, started going to events, but the breakup had clearly affected her deeply. One former coworker, a woman named Jennifer Ross, said Rachel had once mentioned feeling like she'd lost a version of herself during that time, like she'd had to rebuild who she was from scratch. Investigators tracked down the ex-boyfriend, a man named Colin Dreyer. He still lived in Columbus, worked as a software engineer at a tech startup downtown, and had remarried 2 years prior. When questioned, he was cooperative but visibly uncomfortable, the kind of discomfort that comes from being asked about a part of your life you thought was long behind you. He said he and Rachel had dated for nearly 3 years, that they'd met through mutual friends at a concert, that the relationship had been good at first but had slowly unraveled. They'd wanted different things. He'd been ready to settle down, buy a house, start thinking about kids. Rachel had been focused on her career, on travel, on keeping her options open. They tried to make it work, but eventually, they'd both realized it wasn't going to. The breakup, he said, had been amicable, or as amicable as breakups can be. They'd stayed in touch for a few months, texting occasionally, meeting for coffee once or twice, but eventually, the communication had faded. He hadn't spoken to her in years. He had no idea she was missing until detectives showed up at his door. He had an alibi for the days surrounding her disappearance. Security logs from his workplace confirmed he'd been in the office on March 9th and 10th, swiping his badge in at 8 a.m. both days, leaving around 6 p.m. His wife corroborated his whereabouts on the weekend. They'd gone to a friend's wedding in Cincinnati on Saturday, stayed overnight at a hotel, driven back Sunday afternoon. There were receipts, photos, witnesses. There was no evidence linking him to Rachel's case. Still, detectives kept digging. They pulled phone records going back years, looking for any calls or texts between Rachel and Colin. There were none. They combed through her mail, looking for messages, drafts, anything that might suggest she'd been in contact with him or thinking about him. They found nothing. They looked at her social media, scrolling back through years of posts, searching for mentions of him, photos, comments. Nothing. The case grew colder. Media coverage faded. The searches stopped. Rachel's family continued to press for answers, calling the police department every week, asking if there were any updates, any new leads, anything at all. Her mother, Susan, started a Facebook page dedicated to finding Rachel, posting updates, sharing her photo, asking people to keep looking, keep remembering. The page gained a few hundred followers, mostly friends and family, some strangers who felt compelled by the story. But as summer turned to fall, and fall turned to winter, the updates became less frequent. There was only so much you could say when nothing was happening, when the investigation had stalled, when the only thing left to do was wait. Then, nearly a year later, in February of 2020, a hiker discovered something in a wooded area off a rural road about 60 miles south of Bowling Green, near the town of Van Wert. It was a purse, partially buried under dead leaves and dirt, the leather stained and cracked from months of exposure to the elements. The hiker, a man named Todd Brennan who often walked his dog through the area, noticed it because his dog had started digging at the spot, pawing at the ground insistently. Todd pulled the purse free and opened it. Inside were a wallet, a driver's license, and a cell phone. The name on the license was Rachel Hartley. He called the police immediately. The purse and its contents were sent to the state crime lab for analysis. The phone was too damaged to recover any data. The battery had corroded. The screen was shattered. Technicians tried everything they could, but the device was beyond saving. The wallet still contained Rachel's credit cards, her insurance card, her gym membership card, and a small amount of cash, about $30. There were no fingerprints on the items other than Rachel's own, and even those were faint, degraded by time and weather. The location where the purse was found was remote, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that branched off from a larger county route. The area was heavily wooded, with no nearby homes, no businesses, no reason for most people to be there unless they were specifically looking for a place to hike or hunt. Detectives returned to the area, conducted ground searches, brought in cadaver dogs. They walked the trails, checked the underbrush, looked in ravines and drainage ditches. Nothing else was found. No clothing. No remains. No vehicle. The discovery raised the possibility that Rachel had been in that area at some point, but it offered no answers about what had happened to her or where she was now. The discovery of Rachel Hartley's purse in Van Wert, Ohio, only deepened the mystery surrounding her disappearance. The purse had clearly been out in the elements for months. Maybe even since the week she vanished. The leather was weathered. The metal on her phone was corroded. It had seen a full cycle of Ohio seasons, but the location made no sense. Van Wert was miles west of Interstate 75, the highway where Rachel's car had supposedly been spotted. This wasn't on the way to anywhere. It was a deliberate detour. Detectives were baffled. Had Rachel driven there herself? If so, why? What drew her to this isolated spot? Or had someone else driven her car, maybe with her as a passenger, or maybe not? Perhaps the purse was just tossed from a moving car, but if you're getting rid of evidence, why leave behind cash and credit cards? It felt like a contradiction, a puzzle piece that didn't fit. The discovery led to a brief spike in media attention and new tips. But none of them led anywhere. Police questioned Todd Brennan, the man who found the purse. He walked that trail regularly and was certain it hadn't been there long. His dog, always sniffing around, would have found it sooner. This raised another disturbing possibility. Was the purse placed there recently? A deliberate act to mislead the investigation. To make it seem like Rachel was in Van Wert when she never was. Or was it simpler? Just someone finally getting rid of something they'd held onto for months. Every question just led to more questions. As the years passed, the active investigation slowed down. It became what's known as a cold case. In 2021, Rachel's parents, Robert and Susan, hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb. He was a former detective who specialized in cases just like this. Webb spent 6 months digging into every detail, re-interviewing witnesses, and driving the possible routes Rachel might have taken. He visited the places she loved, spoke to people who knew her. But he came to the same conclusion as the police: the facts didn't add up. The car sighting on I-75 clashed with the purse found in Van Wert. The timeline was a mess. Webb told the Hartleys that sometimes these cases are solved years later through a lucky break, an accidental discovery, or a deathbed confession. But sometimes, he said, they're not. Sometimes people just disappear, and the answers disappear with them. In 2023, nearly 4 years after she went missing, Rachel's brother Daniel drove from Denver back to Ohio. He needed to connect with the life his sister had built, and the life that had been stolen. He visited her old apartment and the school where she taught. He even spoke with a few of her former students who remembered her fondly. One of them, Emily Cho, the same student who saw Rachel staring out the window on her last day, was now in art college. She told Daniel that Rachel had written her a letter of recommendation that helped her get into her dream school. She said she still wondered what happened to her teacher. Daniel then drove to Maumee Bay State Park, walking the same trails Rachel had loved, standing by the water where she used to sketch. He was trying to imagine her final days, trying to feel what she might have felt. He also went to Van Wert, to the overgrown dirt road leading to the woods where the purse was found. He walked into the trees, stood in the silence, and just listened. But there was nothing. No answers, no connection, just the sound of the wind. He returned to Denver a week later, with no more clarity, but with a sense that he had borne witness to her life and her absence. The case of Rachel Hartley remains open. The Bowling Green Police Department still lists her as a missing person. Her DNA is in national databases, waiting for a match that may never come. Her family runs a website, keeping her story alive, holding onto the hope that someone, somewhere, knows something. Susan, her mother, has said that sometimes, when the phone rings, she has a split second of hope that it's the call that will explain everything. But it never is. Her father, Robert, dreams that she just walks back into the house. And in the dream, he doesn't ask where she's been, he's just grateful she's home. Then he wakes up. Daniel, her brother, is haunted by their last conversation, a simple text exchange. He sent a thumbs up emoji in response to a photo she sent. That was it. He wishes he'd said more. Wishes he told her he loved her. Now, he can. Investigators have explored every angle: human trafficking, a random act of violence, a planned disappearance. But nothing fits. Random violence is usually chaotic, not methodical like this seems to be. Traffickers typically target a different demographic. Every theory collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, so the case sits, a collection of fragments that don't form a whole picture. A woman, a car on a highway, a purse in the woods. A story without an ending. And the loudest part of this story is the silence. A silence that stretches on, year after year. For most people, it fades into the background. But for Rachel's family, that silence is a constant, heavy weight. The absence of closure, the absence of her. The truth is still out there, somewhere in the space between what we know and what we can only imagine. What do you think happened to Rachel Hartley? Is there a detail in this story that stands out to you? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Sharing this video helps keep Rachel's story alive, and sometimes that attention is what finally brings answers. Thank you for watching.